Most debates regarding the supposed resurrection of Jesus center around gospel reliability, traditional authorship, and supposed facts, whether minimal or maximal, that need to be accounted for. However, I believe there's a much more pressing issue that needs to be addressed in these debates before any of those propositions are discussed, and it's an issue that is often neglected by skeptics when discussing the resurrection of Jesus. And more importantly, it's an issue that I believe is detrimental to the positive case for its historicity. In this video, we'll survey what I take to be the best reason to doubt the resurrection of Jesus. I'd like to begin by surveying an incredible account relayed by the ancient historian Herodotus, who has famously been dubbed the father of history. Herodotus, writing around the 5th century BC in his The Histories, Book 4, chapters 93 through 96, highlights a peculiar and bizarre practice among a specific demographic known as the Thracians. Apparently, a subset of the Thracians belonged to a religious cult of Zalmoxis. Zalmoxis was a human who went through apotheosis and was subsequently deified. And every 4 years it was decided among these Thracians that a messenger should be sent to the realm of Zalmoxis in order to articulate their requests and desires. This messenger is chosen through the casting of lots, and this is where things get strange. The messenger is then grabbed by his hands and feet and is swung onto 3 spears. If the messenger dies as a result, the Thracians view this as a success, and Zalmoxis is understood to have received the message from the messenger. If the messenger is pierced by the spears but fails to expire, then the messenger is viewed as worthless, and another is chosen. What we have here can only be described as barbaric superstition. The belief that the act of throwing a man on a few spears with the intention of killing him has a causal connection to delivering a message to a divine being is the epitome of primitive credulity. But let us now consider a pertinent question. Are the beliefs of the Thracians generally out of the ordinary for individuals in antiquity? That is to say, are their credulous beliefs in magical practices the exception or the rule? For anyone who knows even a modicum about anthropology during this time period, the answer would have to be that the beliefs of the Thracians are not at all unique in this respect. The social fabric of the ancient world was saturated in primitive myth and superstition. Gods, spirits, demons, omens, magic, sorcery, witchcraft, soothsayers, incantations, divination, exorcism, ritual sacrifice, astrology, and necromancy were ubiquitous, and it was taken for granted that these were real phenomena and efficacious practices by largely all civilizations in antiquity. Most of these beliefs and practices centered on an all-pervasive spirit world that demanded constant human appeasement. Ancient Romans, for example, believed in lemures, which were malevolent spirits of the dead, looking to cause harm to the living. Anyone who wasn't properly buried with funeral rites was likely to become one. The Romans took these spirits so seriously that they constructed an entire festival called Lemuria, centered around preventing lemures from troubling the living. One Lemuria ritual entailed the head of each household waking at midnight, walking barefoot, washing his hands with spring water, and then taking a handful of black beans in his mouth and spitting them out or throwing them over his shoulder. This bizarre ritual was also accompanied by a chant to be repeated 9 times. The chant was, "I send these. With these beans I redeem me and mine." While the head of the household does this, the rest of the household clashes bronze pots while repeating, "Ghosts of my fathers and ancestors, be gone." Shifting to ancient Greece, creatures called Erinyes were believed to be fearful winged goddesses with snakes in their hair that punished and avenged crimes, especially including vicious criminal acts against family members. The Erinyes maintained other functions as well. They carried out curses and they punished sinners in the underworld. They were also understood to be the causes of blindness, madness, and infertility. The Greek playwright Aeschylus describes them as, quote, black, altogether disgusting. They snore with repulsive breaths. They drip from their eyes hateful drops. Their attire is not fit to bring either before the statues of the gods or into the homes of men. End quote. That the spirit world was intimately intertwined with the mortal world was not merely part of the ancient mythological paradigm. It also pervaded their superstitious practices and primitive rituals. The barbaric act of cutting open a dead sacrificed animal and appropriating the internal organs, usually the liver, to interpret and deduce divine omens and the will of the gods is the practice known as haruspicy. This act was ubiquitous in ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Rome. The divination priests who performed these rituals were called haruspices. Haruspices believed that the liver, in particular, mirrored the heavens and served as a map of divine territory. Because of this, they had special bronze medals of a liver divided into 40 regions marked with deity names, each connecting to a constellation overhead. A blemish on the liver's right side meant favor from the gods. A blemish on the left meant disaster loomed. Divination was by no means exclusive to the bizarre practice of interpreting the internal organs of dead animals. No, superstitious divination took a multitude of forms and practices. Special priests known as augurs would also interpret omens based on the behavior of birds and chickens. Major government decisions, elections, and even military campaigns could be catalyzed based off of nothing more than how quickly a chicken eats its feed. Other ways of interpreting divine communication through omens included interpreting unnatural or deformed animal births, interpreting the behavior of fire and smoke during animal sacrifices, as well as thunder, lightning, comets, and eclipses. Now, one crucial aspect to note currently before we jump into precisely how these beliefs and practices are relevant to the resurrection proclamations of the early Christians is this. These primitive superstitions and naive customs were pervasive. They didn't only permeate the less educated and the illiterate. They weren't mere folk customs. They were also ubiquitous among the elite, among the educated, and among the literate. Divination was institutionalized and obligatory for public business. As already mentioned, omens significantly influenced major political actions and decisions. Emperors and high officials frequently consulted astrologers, dream interpreters, and omen readers. From the top to the bottom, beliefs, practices, and customs were saturated with credulity and magical thinking. We see this credulity even promulgated by the most literate historians and writers of the time. Writers like Plutarch, Herodotus, Livy, and Suetonius all record common superstitions and magical omens, and in many instances themselves appear to believe in their occurrences. But one of the most illustrative examples of superstition and credulity among the educated and literate comes from none other than the prominent Jewish historian Josephus. On the eve of the Jewish War in 66 AD, Josephus records the following omens. He records the presence of a star in the shape of a sword. And days before the Jews rebelled, as they celebrated the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Josephus records a cow giving birth to a lamb in the temple itself. Then, a few days after the feast, Josephus records the following. Quote, "Besides these, a few days after that feast, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable, were it not related by those that saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For, before sunsetting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds, and surrounding of cities." End quote. The fact that a prominent elite of the time could so easily come to believe in fantastic omens, including celestial signs, cows giving birth to lambs, and witnessing armies of troops and chariots in the sky is telling. The literate, learned, and educated Roman Jewish historian was just as gullible and susceptible to magical and superstitious thinking as anyone else. Hopefully, then, my initial point has been made. The world of antiquity was a period awash in primitive myth, superstition, magical thinking, and gullibility. The next pertinent question then is, what relevance do these facts pose for early Christianity, and in particular the belief in the resurrection of Jesus? Well, I think the relevance should be apparent. The narratives surrounding Jesus' life and ministry are themselves permeated with the very same credulous mythology and magical thinking of antiquity, which reaches its climax in the event of Jesus coming back from the dead. Let's take these considerations in turn. Think of the scale of what's reported in the Gospels. Angels, divine conception and virgin births, demons, possession, exorcism, miracles of nature, divine omens at Jesus' death, mass resurrection, ascension into heaven, and apocalyptic proclamations. Do these events as recorded in the Gospels not seem right at home in their first century context? Are we expected to laugh at the Romans' belief in lemures and their stories of how these evil spirits torment the living and how black beans magically keep them at bay, recognizing it as mere mythology, but we're expected to take as sober history the pericope in Matthew chapter 8 regarding demons being exorcised into a herd of pigs, which subsequently drown themselves? Is it not apparent that these types of beliefs and stories are cut from the same cloth? I mean, pretty much every aspect of the Gospels that I highlighted a moment ago has parallels in mythology of antiquity. Jesus was miraculously conceived, but Alexander the Great and Caesar Augustus were also taken to have been, in some sense, miraculously conceived through the work of a deity. Jesus was taken to be an exorcist and was believed to have exorcised demons in a multitude of cases throughout his ministry. But historians throughout antiquity also record such events. Josephus himself supposedly witnessed a contemporary Jewish exorcist named Eleazar performing an exorcism in the presence of Emperor Vespasian around 70 CE and drawing the demons out through the nostrils of the victim. Historian Lucian of Samosata records an account of a Syrian exorcist who interrogated demons in foreign languages. During Jesus' death, there were supposed omens and portents such as a massive earthquake, a tearing of the temple veil, rocks being split, and graves being opened. But portents like this were typical of ancient mythology. Comets were usually a sign of a great ruler's death and were reported during the death of Julius Caesar and Nero. Suetonius records earthquakes and lightning during Nero's death as well. The death of Agrippina, the wife of Emperor Claudius, was met with the total solar eclipse and thunderbolts. And of course, Jesus in Luke Acts is said to have ascended to heaven following his death and resurrection. This again was typical ancient mythology. Jesus was assuredly not alone in his ascension to heaven. Heracles, Romulus, Julius Caesar, and Caesar Augustus were all at one point in time believed to have ascended to heaven. Again, I ask the viewer, doesn't the story of Jesus appear to be cut from the same cloth as its counterparts from antiquity? Are we really to believe that miraculous births, demons, exorcisms, divine omens and portents, and ascensions to heaven are primitive mythological superstition when told of figures other than Jesus, but are instead clear-headed and sensible historiography when we move to the Gospels? Forgive me, but this simply strains credulity. I mean, heck, even the early Christians understood this issue. Church Father Justin Martyr in his First Apology, chapters 21 and 22, makes my case better than I can. Quote, "And when we say also that the Word, who is the first birth of God, was produced without sexual union, and that he, Jesus Christ, our teacher, was crucified and died and rose again and ascended into heaven, we propound nothing different from what you believe regarding those whom you esteem sons of Jupiter. For you know how many sons your esteemed writers ascribed to Jupiter: Mercury, Asclepius, Bacchus, Hercules, and Bellerophon, who, though sprung from mortals, rose to heaven on the horse Pegasus. And what of the emperors who die among yourselves, whom you deem worthy of deification, and in whose behalf you produce someone who swears he has seen the burning Caesar rise to heaven from the funeral pyre? And if we assert that the Word of God was born of God in a peculiar manner, different from ordinary generation, Let this, as said above, be no extraordinary thing to you, who say that Mercury is the angelic word of God. And if we even affirm that he was born of a virgin, accept this in common with what you accept of Perseus. And in that we say that he made whole the lame, the paralytic, and those born blind, we seem to say what is very similar to the deed said to have been done by Asclepius." End quote. This is a smoking gun. The Christian church father Justin Martyr is forcefully and persuasively making the exact case that I have been elucidating, namely that the story of Jesus is no different in kind than the pagan stories which permeate his contemporaries. Justin Martyr was, after all, addressing his thoughts to a Roman emperor in the 2nd century. Martyr is making the argument that the story of Jesus should not be hard to swallow for a Roman, as their religious paradigm already contained all the relevant parallel beliefs: miraculous births, death, resurrection, ascension, and deification. These beliefs and myths were already in the water. Now, it should quickly be addressed that my argument here is not akin to the parallelomania of the Jesus mythicist movement. That is to say, my argument is not that the Jesus story is copied wholesale and merely derives from pagan mythology. Rather, my argument is that, based on the cultural milieu that we find the early Christian movement situated in, a milieu of myth, superstition, and credulity teeming with magical and miraculous thinking, the Christian narrative exemplified in Jesus' story shows all the telltale signs of said myth and superstition. Think of this probabilistically. As the point has been belabored up until now, we know that the cultural zeitgeist of antiquity was one of primitive and credulous belief systems. The world teemed with spirits, both benevolent and evil. Communication was made between the gods and mortals through unsophisticated and obscure divination and omens. And miraculous and magical signs and wonders permeated the world. Some individuals were supposedly special enough to elicit attention from the gods and lived a life attended by their divine guidance, eventually achieving apotheosis. Given this sociological fabric, how probable is it that a similar 1st century Jewish iteration is cut from the same cloth? How probable is it that a Jewish demographic firmly placed within a credulous and superstitious paradigm would come to espouse similar primitive, superstitious, and credulous beliefs and doctrines? I would argue that it's incredibly probable. It's almost a certainty. And it's even more probable given that this same Jewish demographic already had roots in earlier myths and primitive superstitions. Now, we've come all this way and scant mention has been made of the resurrection of Jesus. The title of the video, after all, has the resurrection as its focal point. So how exactly does anything we've surveyed relate to Jesus' resurrection? Well, I do believe it should be obvious at this point. If the narratives surrounding Jesus' life and ministry are themselves permeated with the telltale signs of the superstition and magical thinking of antiquity, how much more so do these narratives demonstrate this credulous thinking than in the belief that Jesus rose again after his death? The resurrection of Jesus is the pinnacle of such credulity and gullibility. Are we really to survey the mountain of bizarre and unsophisticated beliefs of those in antiquity and, instead of viewing the Gospels in the same light, irrationally affirm that the early Christian belief in the resurrection was formed through sober rationality and sound logical inference? Are the myths and superstitions that prevailed among the Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, and Mesopotamians to be explained through their limited primitive understanding, while belief in the resurrection somehow escapes this diagnosis? I can pose these rhetorical questions until the day's end, but I think any rational person should receive the point. The resurrection of Jesus is part and parcel of the Gospels and the New Testament, and yet it's these very documents, espousing the beliefs of the early Christian church, that we've already seen are in many ways indistinguishable from their credulous contemporaries. The same type of people who believed in omens, magic, sorcery, witchcraft, soothsayers, incantations, and divination, these are the same types of people who came to believe that a man who had died had been raised again. The same type of people who believe that their supreme rulers had miraculous births, ascended to heaven, and became gods, these are the same types of people who came to believe that Jesus of Nazareth resurrected and ascended to heaven. Again, consider this as a statistician. A resurrection is already astronomically improbable. It's about as improbable as any event can be. And in conjunction with this incredibly low probability, we have a case where the proclamation of a resurrection by the early Christians is promulgated by a demographic where these types of false superstitions and mythologies were a dime a dozen. What is the probability that a first-century society, surrounded by and permeated by primitive credulity and gullibility and prone to magical thinking, what's the probability that this society is also going to come to believe in events and happenings that fit these adjectives as well? Surely that probability is high, which in turn significantly lowers our already low prior probability of an actual resurrection. The crucial point here then is that everything we've surveyed adds to our background knowledge. Before we even talk about gospel authorship, gospel reliability, maximal facts or minimal facts, we need to consider the indisputable fact that the ancient world was saturated in exactly the kind of irrational and unsophisticated thinking that easily lends itself to falsely inferring that someone who was previously dead was now alive again. I mean, heck, we see this exact irrationality displayed in the Gospels themselves when it's relayed that others falsely inferred that John the Baptist had been raised from the dead after being decapitated. But that's a dead horse I've already beat. In my opinion, every discussion on the resurrection should begin here, with the superstitious cultural milieu of the ancient world. Once it's established just how incredibly likely it is that the early Jesus movement would have fallen victim to the primitive credulity that it was firmly situated in, the evidence for the resurrection itself is already painted in a different light. A light that is strongly unfavorable to the belief that the resurrection actually occurred. What's more miraculous? That a primitive religious movement steeped in a gullible world where the mythological and the magical were commonplace would come to falsely affirm that a man rose from the dead? Or that this man actually rose from the dead? Clearly, the latter is the greater miracle. And to follow Hume, it's this miracle which we should reject. Thanks for watching.